Hello, my name is Tamal Pilla with the Center for Presidential History at SMU, joined today by Dr. Jonathan Hunt. Dr. Hunt is a historian of America and the world and an assistant professor of strategy at the U.S. Naval War College. Dr. Hunt will be joining us to discuss his book, The Nuclear Club: How America and the World Policed the Atom from Hiroshima to Vietnam, at SMU, December 4th, 6 p.m., McCord Auditorium. Dr. Hunt, thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, Tamal. I'm really excited to talk to you today, give you a little bit of background on the book and the broader subject that it tackles, in hopes that we can, encourage as many butts in the seats, virtual and otherwise, for my book talk on December the 4th.
100%. Let's do that. So first, I want to lead with obviously the title of the book, the Nuclear Club. On the title, you have a few Soviet leaders, Brezhnev, Alexei, Kosygin, and of course on the far right, President Nixon. Talk to me a little bit more about this nuclear club, right? What does that word entail in the context of nuclear arms?
No, it's a great question, and I think one of the features of a book that an author struggles with the most is the title, in large part because it's the first thing that people come across. It often serves to kind of summarize not only the subject matter in this case, the global spread of nuclear science and technology throughout especially the 1950s and in the 1960s, that began to cause consternation, not only among great powers like the United States and the Soviet Union, but also by lesser states, middle powers, US allies, Soviet allies, about what form of world order would emerge if nuclear weapons were to become kind of generally or even universally available to more and more states. So, for me, the nuclear club, and it's a term that's coined pretty early in the history of what scholars call the nuclear age. Sort of this notion of an international elite. At one point in the book, I call it the most exclusive club on earth. That at the time the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is finalized in 1968, that encompasses 5 states: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and the People's Republic of China. Once the People's Republic of China supplants the Republic of China on Taiwan in the UN Security Council in 1971, it also becomes a synonym with the veto-holding members of the UN Security Council. So it's a subject that is both material in terms of which countries acquired nuclear weapons, but also legal and formal. Which countries are, often arrogate to themselves the right to determine who can and cannot manufacture or acquire these weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah. I, as a sort of a spokesperson for the Center for Presidential History, I have to ask about the role of the executive branch, right? How have you seen the role of the president change over the course of this, as you call it, nuclear age?
Yeah. And this was a question that I think confronted presidents, their advisors, the larger bureaucracy, if you will, of the executive branch, the legislative branch as well. I mean, it's important to remember the negotiations and the deliberations over the 1946 Atomic Energy Act. It was amended in 1954, but it along with sort of the norms established by the Truman administration and then perpetuated by future presidential administrations, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, into the Nixon administration, was this notion, and in fact this mandate, that the executive branch, and in particular the office of the president, would have sole positive authority over nuclear weapons. And this was a norm, eventually a law that was codified in U.S. statute, that grew out of the Truman administration's frustration, in fact, over the way in which the first 2 uses of nuclear weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki very much occurred on a military timetable. And so there's some work by Alex Wellerstein, another nuclear historian, who I think makes a pretty good argument that Truman was somewhat blindsided, not by Hiroshima, but rather by Nagasaki. He had not realized that the U.S. Army Air Force, this is, of course, predates the U.S. Air Force, which was established in 1947, would more or less use these weapons as made available under a military logic. Truman, of course, understood that nuclear weapons very much gave rise to questions at the highest level of the state, not only of, say, the way in which to achieve military victory as swiftly and bloodlessly as possible, but how the United States would be perceived in the wider world, especially as it came to assume greater responsibility for world affairs after 1945. So really from inception, nuclear weapons and the office of the president, what Arthur Schlesinger Jr. would call the imperial presidency, grew up kind of hand in hand. And the modern presidency, I would argue, and I think other historians, as well as George Will, have argued, becomes in some ways imbued with this kind of national or even global responsibility, planetary responsibilities that nuclear weapons invoked or perhaps evoked. So the executive branch is absolutely central to this. It is a story that is international in nature. So I also look into Soviet policy, French policy, British, Mexican, Indian. I mean, it's very much a global story, but it's one in which the office of the president plays a really central role, especially under the administrations of Kennedy and Johnson, which are the two administrations that I study and the book studies in the greatest depth and length.
Right. Great. I want to actually kind of take it to the text itself. I pulled a quote here that I thought was super interesting that I thought I'd take this opportunity to ask you about. And here it goes. Correlation between the stability that nuclear deterrence has enforced and the frequency of civil wars, proxy conflicts, and territorial disputes for those outside the nuclear club's ranks. That's a paradox. That seems to me a contradiction. Explain that to me. How do you walk into something with such good intent and then kind of come out the other end with some pretty disastrous consequences?
Yeah, and first of all, kudos to you, because the word paradox is precisely the word to use here. It's also one, and this dynamic, this seeming contradiction, why the world since 1945 has yet to witness, say, a third world war, one that would very much risk escalating beyond the nuclear threshold. Even at the same time as during the Cold War and now the post-Cold War world, we very much have witnessed a succession of civil wars, proxy wars between the Soviet Union, the United States, even Cuba and China during the Cold War, as well as wars of choice. And in this case, I'm thinking of the decision of the George W. Bush administration to invade with a quote-unquote coalition of the willing Iraq on the basis of claims that Saddam Hussein and his regime were seeking weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. So political scientists and IR theorists, one, I think, strong suit, but also maybe trick of the trade for historians is taking concepts that, say, political scientists have developed, in this case, the stability-instability paradox, and more or less trying to show historically, with access to primary sources, the ways in which the historical record does or does not map upon that conception, that theory, that as nuclear weapons make great power war less likely, they can also perhaps make smaller conflicts more likely, right? As they raise the perceived cost of a major conflict, right, to an existential level. They encourage or perhaps incentivize states to seek perhaps limited conflicts that nonetheless can be immensely destructive. And here we can think of the Vietnam War, we can think of the Iraq War and its aftermath in the Middle East, which we consider to see today. So to reiterate, I think that's a great quote to pull out of the book. It's one where I'm pushing the evidence and I think the theory as far as it can take me. This is obviously it's a long period of time, and the book is more focused on the events and the diplomacy, the statecraft of the 1950s and 1960s. But I think it does show us that the nuclear age, even though it is associated with what John Lewis Gaddis called the long peace, it also coincided with considerable violence outside of Europe, or sort of beyond the furthest reach of America's nuclear umbrella and other nuclear umbrellas. And that's something that the book tries to highlight and expand.
Yeah. I think just in the few minutes that we've been talking, we've gotten closer to the heart of this book. Now, this book is well researched, right? There's 70 pages of works cited right at the end. And there's a lot of names, there's a lot going on. It's packed full of good history. But if you had to pick something, sort of the culmination of all those points, right? The main takeaway, what would that be?
Well, it's a great question, and it is a sweeping history. It's one that I think challenged my skills as a researcher, also linguistically. There are documents from the former Soviet archives, so documents that were translated from Russian, from the French archives, from the Mexican archives. I very much aimed in kind of conception and execution to achieve to the best of my ability the sources necessary to corroborate some of my claims. I think, just in the spirit of the Center for Presidential History, one of my, I suppose, favorite discoveries, and perhaps my favorite, one of the interventions I'm most proud of, is about the Kennedy and Johnson administrations and the ways in which, over the course of the 1960s, keeping in mind this is a time when anti-nuclear discourse and really, fear of nuclear weapon use, fear of nuclear fallout, which was often symbolized through the figure of a young suburban child. So there's this famous political advertisement. Basically, it's one of the first campaign attack ads in 1964. Lyndon Johnson is running for the first time at the head of his own ticket for president of the United States, and he's facing Barry Goldwater, who, over the months preceding the election, made some fairly bombastic comments about the utility of nuclear weapons in places like Vietnam or Korea. And so Johnson and his team came up with, it comes to be known as the Daisy ad. It's this young blonde girl in a field of daisies, picking petals from one of them, counting down from 10 to 1, at which point this sort of older male voice cuts in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then this massive nuclear explosion fills up the screen, stating, "These are the stakes. A world in which our children can live, or a path," and I'm paraphrasing here, "or a world in which we will all die. Vote for President Johnson on November 8th. The stakes are too high to stay home." And it only airs one time, because it's a pretty blunt implement. It's not exactly an attack ad that was heavy on nuance. But I think it spoke to these kind of, especially suburban fears. This is the time of the baby boom. One of the largest cohorts of young adults that were coming of age. Many would go on to march and protest against the Vietnam War, to serve in the Vietnam War after being drafted. But at the time, it was their parents who were voting in droves. And so first Kennedy and then Johnson sort of harnessed this rhetoric of guardianship, what I call in the book nuclear guardianship, to reassure these anxious suburban parents that they had them and their children's health, well-being and security in mind. And this helps to justify nuclear negotiations, what had been up until that point the arch rival, right? The red menace of the Soviet Union. To the extent that Johnson in particular, deeply political animal, one who's seeking to maintain his electoral and the Democratic Party's electoral prospects in the midst of major legislative triumphs and earthquakes, right? The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Immigration Act, looks to nuclear diplomacy as a way to put him, as one of his advisors, Bill Moyers, called it, on the side of the angels. And to the extent that this is a story about high-level statecraft, about the Cold War, about the formation of a kind of global nuclear order, it's also the story of American presidents sort of reframing their role as a guardian, not only to, say, American business or to American national interests, but in fact to American families and by association, humanity itself, present and future generations. And so it's one way in which I think this larger story of the creation of the nuclear club also tells us a lot about how the United States claimed and then brought a kind of parental logic, a kind of paternal logic to its foreign policy that became increasingly increasingly sort of unbounded in its aspirations.
Yeah. I want to ask you about something that I actually didn't have prepared before the interview, but it's something that you just mentioned, and that was you had to work with a lot of primary sources in Russian, presumably Spanish, Hindi, any of these countries that you researched. To go out there, research their primary sources, you have to deal with, in some sense, a secondary source, right? These translations of these primary sources. Is that a challenge at all? Do you feel like you're maybe not getting the essence of the document when you do that? How is research through translation? How does that manifest itself in your research?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it's one, I sort of look back on myself, it's a book that was based off of my PhD dissertation. So it was one that I developed as a PhD student, looking at the field, asking myself, what is new, what is interesting, what is significant, what is important. And as a sort of dewy-eyed 22, 23-year-old, as I was conceptualizing this project, one of the things that I suppose enticed me or excited me was the opportunity to learn languages. And so all the documents in French were translated by myself, Spanish as well, Russian, although almost always with assistance. And so I think this is partly where, scholars are always operating as a part of a community. So in my acknowledgments, I think I have four or five, maybe more people that I thank basically for sharing documents with me, translating those sources. Of course, there's always that added responsibility to go through the translation yourself, to at least kind of spot check and make sure that if I'm using if I think something is particularly important, that I do the due diligence to make sure that it doesn't have an additional meaning, or it wasn't, slightly mistranslated, or the emphasis is on the wrong part of the quotation. In addition, one of the great things, another dimension of studying nuclear weapons is classification. And so in the United States, many of these documents, they're born classified in most cases, if they touch upon nuclear weapons, energy, power, et cetera. And they are declassified over time. But the difficulties of navigating these regimes of classification is really compounded when you're working across multiple different national regimes, right? So it's not just, say, censors in the United States, it's also in France, in India and Mexico, pretty much anywhere that you want to study this. So I've really benefited from the growing network of nuclear historians who share sources. The real kind of the nexus for this is the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. They have two projects, one, the Cold War International History Project, as well as the Nuclear Proliferation History Project, that gather, translate, and circulate, make digitally available these sources. So I would say a not inconsiderable amount of those 70 pages, I'm not going to try to put a number on it, but they're actually sources that you or anybody else, student, professor, or just the interested public, can go and read online, not only in translation, but also in the original source, which is pretty cool, right? That's something that I couldn't really do when I was an undergraduate, but is kind of almost take it for granted in 2023.
It really is. That is pretty cool. I want to leave you with one question, and that has to do with your talk on December 4th. I'm an undergrad student, right? I have a lot of buddies in engineering, in Meadows, which is our art school. What do you say to those students who aren't necessarily interested in history, nuclear history, who might have some free time on their hands? What do you say to those kids who are on the fence about attending your talk?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. I think the first thing I would emphasize is, to study nuclear weapons, you almost have to be what we call multidisciplinary. I was an undergraduate science student myself. I started out in biochemistry, aerospace engineering. I always fascinated by scientific subjects, even down to the ways in which nuclear weapons are built, to the extent we can sort of share information in the public realm. And so I think this is a talk that not only looks, I mean, of course, it is going to be focused somewhat more on the presidential history of it all, just in keeping with the spirit of the center itself. But it's a subject that I think crisscrosses a number of different domains. It should interest scientists and engineers, because it's about how societies and states navigate the challenges that scientific innovation, right, and advancement can pose, whether it's to national security or to, say, the development. Of course, nuclear energy in the 50s and 60s was really considered to be the bleeding edge of the frontier, of the scientific frontier. So it caused these, really, big issues when powerful states told developing countries like India, like Argentina or Mexico, hey, you're not allowed to build these. It's like, well, okay, but a lot of the precursors to this are forms of science and technology that would help our society develop and become perhaps rise in terms of the international pecking order of science and technology, right? More generally, I'd say it's a subject that, unfortunately, is becoming more and more salient, that is becoming more and more pressing. We live in a world where conflicts between great powers, say the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the possibility that the People's Republic of China might seek to reincorporate, to annex Taiwan, the current chaos and bloodshed in Israel-Palestine shows that while nuclear weapons may seem very far to their generation, they still pose a clear and present danger to the world in which they live, and sadly still to human security, to all of us who consider ourselves part of global citizens, national citizens, but also just members of humanity. So I think it's a subject whose importance is almost speaks for itself, but alas, it's also a subject whose importance is becoming more and more dire as the world becomes perhaps less and less orderly and more conflict prone.
Yeah. Well, hey, thanks for taking the time. Really, I'm super, super excited to see you speak. As a reminder, December 4th, 6 p.m., McCourt Auditorium. Dr. Hunt, thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tamal, and I'm really looking forward to it. I'll see you in a little less than a month. Happy Veterans
Yes,
Day.
sir. Awesome.